Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for joining today. My name is Matt Sellner, Commissioner here at IES's National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance. Before we get started, I wanted to spend just a minute sharing with each of you why this presentation and the topic of scaling research-based innovation is so important to IES. Many of you have no doubt heard our director, Mark Schneider, talk about how IES is an applied science agency. And when he does, he's less about making the distinction between basic and applied research. Clearly, IES funds both kinds, and more about making clear about the impact he hopes your work has, which is to be used to change the lives of students for the better by changing conditions on the ground. That happens when your discoveries find their way into the practice of classroom teachers, into the decisions of education leaders in schools and districts, and into the hands of federal, state, and local policymakers. It's about making sure that what you're learning is applied to the professional practice of education and education stakeholders from early childhood through adulthood. For the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure of working with this team, supporting IES's SEER principle of scaling. If you aren't familiar with the SEER principles, just Google IES and SEER, S-E-E-R, and you'll find our website. The guide we're discussing today can be found there, and I'd commend it to you. You're about to see a distillation of this work, a bit of a teaser. The model of scaling SRI we'll present today, and I don't want to steal your thunder, centers on questions that you as PIs can ask, models you can follow, that help ensure that your scholarship is applied in the ways I've described. For a few of you, this may feel like old hat, but for many more, I suspect this will feel a little new. The model will push you to think not only about how your research fills a gap in existing scholarship, but also how, if fully realized, can fill gaps in the education marketplace of ideas, resources, tools, and products. I'll end by saying that this is an issue of great importance to IES. We want your work to change lives. One way that happens, we hypothesize, is by encouraging PIs to think with intentionality about scaling before the work even begins. Those of you who applied for grants this year, or perhaps you just read our RFAs to get a sense of where IES is headed, began to see some of that in the questions that we encourage you to consider in preparing your applications. SRI has challenged our thinking, and I hope they challenge yours. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleagues to begin. And once again, thanks for being here. Sherry?
Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. I'm Sherry Golan, President of SRI Education's division, and in this presentation, we're going to be talking to you about the invent, apply, transition model and how it could be used to help support successful scaling and sustaining of evidence-based education innovations. We have panelists joining us to give us their reflections on their personal experiences with this scaling process as well. For the agenda today, I'll start with some project background information. Then Jennifer Wu will explain the framework in more detail and give you some key findings from our study. We then have 3 panelists who will provide personal reflections on scaling education innovations and how they relate to particular aspects of the IAT framework, the Invent, Apply, Transition framework. At the end, we may have time for questions. So in terms of background, SRI International is a nonprofit research and development organization with 75 years experience in scaling research in various fields, such as computer science, biosciences, physical and environmental sciences, and imaging. SRI has a ventures group that supports transition of its research to market. Leaders from SRI's ventures group presented on basic transition methods to IES leadership. From that meeting, the idea to try to apply the Invent, Apply, Transition model to education innovations was born. SRI's IAT framework has successfully scaled early research in areas such as robotics, healthcare, and enterprise software, leading to the creation of more than 50 companies worth over $50 billion. In the IAT model, I stands for invent. Invent is the process of ideation and understanding the need and use case. The goal is to invent a solution concept that is likely to address an unmet need. Apply sets out to prove the solution works and to demonstrate its usefulness and convenience for potential applications. A key element of apply is to get a good product user fit, in which one demonstrates that the technology satisfies the needs of the principal or end users. Transition is all about the route to the market and getting to a good product market fit, in which one demonstrates that the technology satisfies the needs of all stakeholders, so including decision makers who are not the direct users of the innovation, and that the innovation offers a better solution than existing options. SRI often partners researchers with entrepreneurs to help them gather and use information needed to ensure a strong needs hypothesis, product user fit, stakeholder mapping, initial market analysis, product market fit, and a scaling pathway hypothesis are produced. So the goal of this project was to examine whether the invent, apply, transition framework could be adapted to provide IES researchers with a systematic approach to sustainably scaling education innovations. SRI explored the idea of using this framework with several education experts who have been involved in developing, transitioning, and purchasing education innovations. These experts suggested adaptations and nuances that we incorporated into the modified framework and present in our full report. The framework identifies issues and topics that we as researchers may not typically focus on, especially during the early phases of our research and development work. Using the framework can support thinking and communicating earlier about important topics that can impact the ultimate scalability and sustainability of an innovation. We understand that the IAT framework is a paradigm shift for most of us in research. Researchers tend to focus on the science of the innovation, building the evidence base. However, the framework pays equal attention to understanding the values of the system. For example, what are the outcomes that matter most to the end user and customer? And the context of the implementation. How does the innovation fit within existing schools and district systems? Having a holistic view of all three concepts, so evidence, customer needs, and system fit, concurrently can help research efforts scale more effectively. We acknowledge that the IAT framework will not be a fit for all education innovations, but we hope that it will raise important planning considerations and areas for communication between researchers and users and customers that will increase the likelihood of evidence-based education innovations being able to sustainably scale into practice. To identify the ways the IAT model could be adapted for education innovations, we worked with an advisory council and a panel of experts with different perspectives and different functional roles. We engaged 4 advisory council members and 9 panel members. They included researchers who have successfully scaled education innovations, executives at ed tech startups, venture capitalists, who primarily fund education innovations, and district administrators. The study team began this project by conducting a brief literature scan to identify common scale-up strategies used by education researchers. This scan helped the SRI team identify some potential areas or gaps that the scaling of education innovations might benefit from in terms of startup methodologies used by other fields. We presented SRI's IAT model to each of the advisory council members and expert panel members to gather feedback on how to tailor the framework for educational contexts and how to identify barriers that prevent evidence-based practices from sustainably scaling. The study team then synthesized the learnings from the interviews and made relevant modifications to the IAT framework. The study team has prepared a public report that describes the revised framework and provides a summary of the lessons shared by the advisory council members and experts. Now I'm going to hand it off to Jennifer Wu, who will talk to you about the framework in more detail and highlight a few of the key findings.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Wu, Associate Director of Ventures at SRI International. I work with entrepreneurs and researchers to spin out new startup companies. So what you see here today is a high-level outline of the scaling framework that we created. This was created through our own experiences at SRI Scaling Research, the experiences of our advisory council and expert panelists, as well as well-accepted startup methodologies. We anticipate that every scaling journey will have their own different twists and turns, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter formula that will lead to a successful scaling of education innovations. But what we've attempted here is to create a generalized framework tailored for education researchers that can mitigate failure points that we oftentimes see during the scaling process of promising research. We hypothesize that this model can be a small step forward to help close the research to practice gap, with the goal of getting more evidence-based interventions adopted by the field. Many of the concepts in this table will be completely foreign to you. We don't expect researchers to possess the skill sets necessary to complete the scaling task. We strongly recommend that researchers be paired with expert support, and we call these individuals embedded entrepreneurs, in order to complete these activities. The goal of this framework is to surface questions early on in the innovation process to increase the odds of successfully scaling promising research. We expect that researchers will need to go out into the field to talk to users and decision makers, deeply understand the competition, and identify what features are needed to displace existing solutions. This is an iterative approach that might take years to complete. We go into great detail on all these components in our paper, but in today's presentation, we'll focus on a subset. Here are the areas that we've identified as common gaps that occur during transition planning. We'll present questions that researchers should ask to mitigate failure points that may be a result of insufficient specificity in the following areas. The first area is in regards to the needs definition or problem statement. The needs identified by the researcher may not always be the needs held by administrators or local education agencies. Right off the bat, if your problem statement is not shared by the field, no matter how promising the research may be, you don't have a customer base that's asking for this new innovation. Who is the customer? Researchers tend to focus on the end user. However, in most cases, the end user is not the customer. You need to understand and identify the ecosystem of stakeholders. Stakeholders are functional roles that hold influence in the decision-making process. All of their needs need to be met before new innovation will be adopted. A thorough stakeholder mapping should be done early to make sure that all of the requirements are incorporated in the development lifecycle. 3, make your products easy to use and make sure they seamlessly fit within the existing systems. And lastly, how does your innovation compare to existing solutions on the market? Why is it better? Why will a stakeholder pick your new innovation over all others? Understand the competition and make sure that innovation has substantial differentiation. Now we'll dig a little deeper into each of these specific areas. First one, are the needs identified by researchers widely shared by district stakeholders and intended users? There are a lot of education innovations out there. We heard from decision makers that they are inundated by hundreds of new products every year, hundreds. How will a new innovation stand out from the crowd? First, make sure you are building something that local education agencies are looking for. There's a limited amount of district resources, both in regards to budget and training hours. They're allocating these resources to high priority needs. Is your innovation addressing a high priority need? Here, we suggest questions that should be asked early on in the innovation lifecycle to ensure that there's alignment in the needs definition between the researchers and the fields. Who are the important stakeholders and what are their needs and priorities? Stakeholders are functional roles that have influence in the decision-making process. They can be end users, district superintendents, directors of curriculum, or technology and security officers. Apologies for the typo on the second quote. It's meant to read, there are many people who can say no, and very few people who have the power to say yes. Stakeholder mapping is the exercise to identify those who need to say yes. Listed on the slides here are the questions that researchers can ask. An example of a stakeholder requirement from a chief technology officer of a school district may be that the innovation must integrate with Google Classroom and comply with data privacy regulations. If you don't seamlessly fit within the existing technical infrastructure, you have nearly a 0% chance of being adopted. In order to complete a thorough stakeholder mapping, you'll not only have to identify the stakeholders, but also map out the requirements the innovation will need to fulfill in order to satisfy each of their functional needs. Convenience and adaptability are as important as impact and cost, if not more. Make your solution easy to use and allow for adaptation. This quote here from an expert panelist helps illustrate an example where convenience was prioritized over effect size. Here are the questions you may ask about your own innovation. How does this make the user's life easier? What components of the innovation can be flexibly adapted and what parts need to be replicated? Does the innovation seamlessly fit with the existing systems of the host environment? Teachers are overwhelmed and need tools that are easy to use and give them room for adaptation. Stop comparing your innovations to other education products. End users today are accustomed to consumer applications where user experience is prioritized. Start setting the bar high to achieve user experiences that are as seamless as the products that we use every day. Think about how quickly it is for a young child to learn how to use an iPad. The design is so intuitive. Another example is Spotify, the music and podcast app. It's so easy to find new content and create curated lists. New innovations need to achieve a high degree of usability in order to be adopted. Has an initial market analysis been completed? The initial market analysis will identify competitive products. This analysis will help you understand how differentiated your innovation must be, as well as inform a scaling transition pathway. Are you aware of the competition in your field? The customers will be comparing the new innovation to other options on the market. So it's better to get in front of the competition early on as you develop your differentiation. Here are some comparison points you can use to help create a competitive matrix. Performance. What kind of impact does the innovation have on education outcomes and how quickly can you see that effect? Reliability. How well can the innovation be implemented in a variety of contexts? Can the innovation achieve its intended outcomes for all intended users? Convenience. How easy is it to implement and how smoothly does it fit within the context in which it is being used? And cost. What are the financial and labor investments needed for implementation? Are these estimates feasible? And now, what are the transition pathways to sustainably scale a promising innovation? Our hypothesis depends on whether the innovation is a complete solution or a feature. Complete solutions are composed of multiple features. They will replace existing solutions, meet the market needs, and have a strong point of differentiation. Complete solutions can go on to become standalone startups or be integrated into larger existing companies. Features can also have a big impact. However, to sustainably scale, they will either need to be tied to other features to form a complete solution or be integrated within a broader solution. The initial market analysis and stakeholder mapping will provide direction on what is a feature versus complete solution. At SRI, we had a project that was looking at the visualization of algebraic functions, such as how it impacts slope. The feature had positive impacts on students' performance in algebraic math. However, it was a feature, not a full algebra curriculum. So we explored combining it with programs that districts use to support their existing algebra curricula and online homework clubs. In summary, the key recommendations we wanted to highlight in today's presentations are: ensure your needs hypothesis reflects the priorities and needs of districts, teachers, and other key stakeholders. Recognize the importance of convenience and adaptability in addition to performance and reliability. Understand where and how the innovation will fit into the field to drive the design specifications and scaling pathway. I know this is a lot of new information to digest, and we hope that there are some key takeaways from today's presentation that you will incorporate into your own scaling journey. We've included a link in the next slide to the full paper that will have details on all of the scaling activities. So from here, I'd like to pass it off to Jay Connor, CEO and founder of Learning Ovations, to get his reactions.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was just marvelous. And in many ways, my reactions are, you really nailed it. You kind of have a sense of what it's like for the practice of bringing research out to the field. And so what I thought I would do is zero in on some of the key areas of experience that we had that can maybe flesh out some of the strategies that you discussed. First of all, I just want to explain that I'm Chairman, CEO of Learning Ovations, who is really charged with bringing my wife, Carol Connor's A to I research to practice. All children reading at or above grade level by the end of third grade. So in many ways, Jennifer, I guess you'd say over the last 10 years, I've been the embedded entrepreneur, helping to support Carol's work, bringing it to the marketplace. But this work wasn't just a clear handoff in terms of Carol finished the research and then we handed it off for implementation and scale. Implementation and scale actually started very early in Carol's journey. Back in 2008, I received an SBIR grant from the department to help me help Carol ask the question of who's the customer. And at that point in time, most of Carol's research was really zeroed in on making these tools and these resources available to individual teachers. And we were working with Decatur, Illinois, and really found and understood that a teacher was as much a victim of the larger system than they were able to control what was going on in their own classroom. For in many ways, for teaching reading, a teacher is faced with being committed to a specific curriculum or a specific set of assessments, or even a specific professional development protocol in terms of how to proceed. So that then informed Carol's work to say, well, maybe we have to think about that larger system as being the true customer. Maybe we need to think about the district as really the customer for Carol's work. And as we applied that, we began to understand what are the impediments then for easy application at that district level. And one of the biggest impediments, and Jennifer, you talked about this, is asking the district to fit you in and add things to an existing system. You have to do as much as you possibly can to fit in to how the district presently operates. And one of the critical elements for us was that around curriculum, is that if we needed and required that each district purchase their own curriculum, we would have priced ourselves outside of the marketplace. We needed to figure out a way of how could we be agnostic to all the evidence-based curriculum and apply Carol's technology and Carol's recommendations to a district's existing set of curriculum. And in the process of doing that, we also had to incorporate teachers and administrators as co-designers for our work. Since they were ultimately going to be the users of that work, they needed to own, in many ways, the decisions that we had to make in terms of make it applicable to you. You know, Jennifer, you referred to UX, you know, in terms of whether it's the iPad or whether it's any other present technology. Researchers have to be very cognizant of what is the user's experience? What is the UX that goes to developing their product? So it can be enhancing practice as opposed to something added on to practice. The next thing is your whole point about the purchasing and the gatekeeper. I would highly recommend to all researchers the book Strategic Selling. What that really forces a researcher to go through is think, who are the influencers? Who are the people that play a role within the decisions to use your research within their application? So again, it's probably about a 15-year-old book, but it's a really excellent kind of waypoint for researchers to look at. And you can't, from a researcher standpoint, assume that the people that are going to purchase and acquire your really thoughtful, creative, highly intelligent research are going to bring that same level of competency. Most people buy things out of the limbic brain. They buy things in terms of addressing pain or addressing things that they're afraid of. So you have to be able to talk to your teachers, if that's who you're selling to, or the district in terms of what is their present pain that your research can help them overcome. If you just give them graphs and randomized control trial data, it's unlikely that you'll have meeting two. It has to be something that really fits with what their need is. And that generally is what is their pain or what is their fear. And then the last point I think that I'd like to make is that to know whether you're improving a present practice or whether you're adding to the system. In this next slide, in teaching reading, you're really talking about a whole fragmented set of things that have to be lined up to be able to get to successful reading, whether you're talking about curriculum, assessments, the data, the individualized instruction, and now certainly the science of reading. Is that our innovation was not at each one of these different fragmented pieces. It was, how could we align all of those pieces to be able to support a teacher in a systemic way to be able to deliver those outcomes? So understand where on that spectrum of application your research fits. And then the next one, the next slide, really relates to, for us, we were very much looking at population level change. So we needed to think in terms of our outcomes and our results at that high level of population. And this is the results of the last 3 years with almost 7,000 students that have seen A to I in classrooms, K1, K2, K3. It allows us to then demonstrate to the future customers that this is about that systemic population change, and none of the other organizations that are just focusing on curriculum or just focusing on PD or assessment can make that kind of commitment to them to help them change all of the children within their classrooms. So I'm going to hand it over to Roberta.
I'm Roberta Galenkoff at the University of Delaware, and I really enjoyed that talk. I feel that it highlighted so many important things that we have to consider up front. And my bet is that the contents of that presentation will influence the kinds of things that are requested in grants. And I don't think that's a crazy thing at all. I think it would be wonderful if we get people to think about these things up front before they put in the application. There's one thing niggling at me, though. I very much agree with invent, apply, and transition, but I'm wondering if there's a fourth stage, and that's adoption. I think transition by itself means that you found someone to put your product out, but it doesn't capture the kinds of stuff that Jay talked about too, which is trying to get your innovation, whatever it is, picked up. I also think that what's missing as part of adoption to get people excited about what you have is dissemination. Because if people don't know there's a new tool out there, you need to create buzz around it, whatever it is. And that means that you need to speak to audiences like at conferences like AERA and the conferences for that teachers go to specifically for math or for reading, to help them learn about the new things that are out there so that they and their administrators can talk about what these products are and whether the products bring them further along than where they started. So I really, really enjoyed what you proposed, but I am thinking that there is another step. And I think that's where I am with a couple of my projects now. So the first project I'd like to tell you about is called the Quills, the Quick Interactive Language Screener, which was obviously funded by IES. And the investigators on the Quills project were so passionate about the importance of developing a good language screener for the field that we didn't do what you guys recommended and talk to schools. We knew the literature and we were determined to prevent another child from being discovered. This happened all the time when I would speak to speech language pathologists. They say, we just found Johnny. He's 5 years old, hasn't said a word. Well, how could that be? It's because we're not thinking about screening children early on for whether they might have language issues. If we had screened Johnny when he was 3, we might have been in a position to intervene more effectively and efficiently and certainly quicker to help Johnny achieve the level that he should have by the time he was 5 and in kindergarten. So the other reason that we're so passionate about language is that our own research, Amy Pace is the first author on this piece, shows that language is the single best predictor of academic outcomes in a variety of areas, including, of course, math and reading, when measured in kindergarten compared to anything else measured in kindergarten. So we know this from a large data set. And it's a very, very important thing to consider because reading, as I like to say, is parasitic on language. And if you don't have good language, it will be difficult for you to become a good reader, and you will likely fall off the cliff in the 3rd and 4th grade when learning to read turns into reading to learn. So I'm very proud to say that the literature was excellent for us, even though many studies in language development had very few subjects. The literature is really what we called upon to create the items that we put into the screener. And of course, we went through 2-item tryouts, etc. The Quills, the original Quills, is for children from 3 through 5. A group at Harvard is collaborating with us, and they used it with 6-year-olds and also found that they could predict to reading outcomes from using the Quills. That's really important and makes the point about how reading is parasitic on language. We have since extended the Quills downward. We call it the baby Quills. And we're hoping to get that out as well, because we know it can't go as far with us just sharing it with researchers as it can if it is brought out by a publisher. So in the transition stage, we worked with Brooks Publishing to bring the Quills out. But I still think that there's another stage, and that's the stage of adoption, when you get people to recognize that this is out there and to pick it up in comparison to anything else they might be doing. The problem is with language that there aren't many language screeners that are routinely used in school. So we have the double burden of saying, hey, this is a really good thing to do. And you might not be screening for language now, but given that language predicts how children do in all subjects, it would be a really good thing to do early so you could identify kids who need additional support. And we're still working on that. We're still trying to find ways to make people aware of the necessity to screen language early. This is one of the oldest things we've known for a long time in psychology, that if there is a problem and you can get to it early, children are going to do better than if you wait and let them fester in that problem and lose ground. So I think we've been reasonably successful with the original Quills from 3 through 5 and now 6, working with Brooks Publishing to get it out. But I still feel like there is more to be done. And we continue to speak about it whenever we have the opportunity. Of course, COVID put a little kibosh on that. But we and the other, myself and the other co-authors of the instrument have taken every opportunity to go out into the world and to talk about how one can use this screener to find kids who have potential language problems. The second project I would talk about, we call the Ultimate Playbook for Reimagining Education. And this came out of a book I wrote with Kathy Hirsch-Pasek called Becoming Brilliant, What Science Tells Us About Raising Successful Children. And we recognized in that treatise and in subsequent work that we haven't affected the achievement gap in the way that we would like, and that many children are not happy in school now, excuse me, as there is lots of testing going on that isn't necessarily contributing to their outcomes, and that many teachers are unhappy. And all we have to do is look at the number of teachers who leave the field to know that. We think that teachers' autonomy in many cases have been removed, and that they are literally working with scripted curricula tools all the time. And that's not enjoyable for them. It steals them from their creativity, and it steals children's creativity and ability to query and question. So our framework is based on playful learning. And we've learned from our research that free play is not as useful for kids in learning curricular materials as is guided play. Guided play is when adults have a curricular goal in mind and follow children's lead in helping them to uncover what it is to be learned. And we began our journey by having Carol Lautenbach, who was the assistant superintendent of a school district in Michigan, call us and say, no one is happy. We want to change what we are doing. And the model that you propose in your book sounds like it will work. So we worked with the Godfrey Lee School District in Michigan. Of course, COVID got in the way again. Immigration got in the way because we couldn't go into classrooms to observe because they were worried about people from immigration coming in. But after 2 years, we found gains in this program after we worked with teachers to help them understand how guided play works in the classroom. Now we're in schools in Pennsylvania and in New Hampshire, and we continue to talk about this work quite a lot because we are really hoping that we can get more schools to switch to this model. The curriculum per se doesn't matter. The program is agnostic to the curriculum. It's an approach. It's the way that teachers and children work together, and teachers report feeling much more positive about teaching and much less likely to leave the field, given that they have had their autonomy restored And given that they are encouraged to work with other teachers in their schools to create the kinds of experiences for children that will get children interacting together to learn. We also support the use of the 6 C's, which appear in our volume and also in a Brookings piece that we've written. Kathy Hirsch-Pasek is first author on that. And these are the skills that kids need for the 21st century. And when we talk about what goes on in these classrooms, it's using the principles that all of us in the field have developed through thousands of scientific papers, principles of how children learn. Obviously, if learning is active, meaningful, and engaging, the kids are going to learn more than if they're sitting passively and listening to the sage on the stage. And the principles that we call the 6 C's are the ones that we all need and we continue to develop even as adults: collaboration, communication, content. Content must be there. Content is essential. Critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. If you fail, you pick yourself up and try again. And these 6 C's can also be assessed, and we are working on how to do that. Right now, it's in a qualitative way, and teachers are finding that they are enjoying the experience of being in the classroom much more, and they are surprised at how their children are responding to this approach. So we're kind of in transition now. We are writing an edited book about this program, and we know that it won't be enough, that we will have to continue to disseminate and speak widely to help people understand the value of shifting the pedagogical orientation they presently hold in the schools, many schools. So thank you so much. I would now like to turn to Chris Hansen.
Thank you, Dr. Golenkoff. My name is Chris Hansen. I'm a curriculum director at a school district in Wisconsin. And earlier, Dr. Connor referred to me as a gatekeeper, as a person who is in some ways the consumer, one of the consumers, I think, that is important. So my first point is simple. Practitioners and researchers, we must collaborate more frequently. I don't think I've not been to the AERA. I don't know how many K-12 educators go there. I don't know how many higher ed educators go there who aren't educational researchers, but we simply don't talk enough and talk about the realities of schools enough. I really feel like I would love to know you more, and I would love to spend more time talking to you about how your money comes in, how you make a living, and how you impact student learning. I think it's obvious in some ways, but I had to put it on the slide. Like, sometimes science does not change people's minds, and look no further than some of the things in the news right now, but the science is so valuable, but the traditions of education are so powerful. And researchers in some ways are introducing new ideas to that are against the traditions of teaching. And during the holiday season, I can tell you that as I walk through our buildings, I see it everywhere. I would also say that higher education has some traditions that don't follow their own science of or school of education research. It disheartens me as a adjunct professor how universities work sometimes. And I would say, if you have influence in your universities or through venture capitalists, I would say, let them know there's a difference between a way to make money and a way to change a child's lives. Those are really different things, and we need to have deep conversation about that. I'm excited about the framework from SRI. I think it creates a common language for us to have those conversations. I do want to see venture capitalists and classroom teachers having conversations, as all of us need to get together and have a conversation, and we should continue to engender that in our profession. When I think of scaling, I am the human checkbook in some ways. My phone rings hundreds of times a month. and I look at my phone and I look at the number and I say, is it out of state or isn't it out of state? That's the very first question I'm thinking in my head. Am I going to pick this up? Is this a sales pitch? And there's so much that comes through the door that I have to start to sort and select about what's going to most impact kids. For our school district, we really heavily rely on the professional learning community model, which is to say, we're going to use a framework by which we collaborate whether this is really impactful and test it and see in a pilot setting, is it going to work? And sometimes having to say no is part of the hard part of the whole deal. I think many people want education to change on a dime, and it won't. I think frameworks are only as good as their collective understanding. So I believe in implementation science as well. And I know that that's part of the paper. And I really believe that all of you understand that. It's so important for us to realize, as Dr. Golenkoff said, there is an implementation curve here. I would never think that something is going to really impact students for probably 3 years. No matter how easy it is to click, no matter how agnostic you are in the curriculum, it just takes mental processing time. And I just want you to understand that it's complex. This whole process is so complicated that we have written about it for years and years and years, and the variables change all the time. When Jen Wu talks about performance, reliability, convenience, and cost, these are common language terms that we do definitely need to talk about. But we also need to talk about the big picture and how we can work together. I do think that there is, at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about just having the right question. I want better results for my students in science and math. I also want my students to feel safe. I want my students to realize their full potential and have self-actualization and everything in between. It's so important to have the right question to really make incremental change and get it to the hands of the people who really matter. So I know that that's hard, and I would just ask you to stay patient. If you're a venture capitalist watching this, invest in education. We're a good customer. On the other hand, know that it's really, really difficult to move a school system. I'm in a relatively small one. I have 4,500 kids. There are much smaller in the state of Wisconsin, and there are very big ones out there. So just understand it's about complexity. Thank you so much for listening. I really want to say that I am so grateful to be in this panel and as a part of this entire event. I'm happy to answer questions later. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Thanks to all of today's panelists. I hope the session was, as we promised, thought-provoking. It may have even challenged you at points, and that's okay too. But I hope that you were also convinced that it is critically important to think about who will use your work and how it will be used. And I look forward to talking with you about it more. Hey everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Q&A. We really appreciate you hanging in there with us. We have just a few folks who are coming in on the waiting room. And I am sure my colleagues, my fellow co-presenters are diligently hunting for that IES approved background, Zoom background that they are going to put on. or they're feeling shamed like that they forgot to put it on, although.
I'm just lucky I got on.
There we go. Hey, everyone. Again, thanks for joining. My name is Matt Sellner. I'm the commissioner for our National Center for Education Evaluation here at IES. I am joined by a really great team of colleagues who you just heard present about our experience in developing the SRI scaling guide. And somebody has some audio in the background. You might want to, there we go, mute yourself. Developing the SRI scaling paper, and then some of our advisors on that project, and then real life researchers like Jay and Roberta, who've had application applying principles of scaling to their work so that the hard work of innovation and discovery that they have done with us actually impacts the experience of students and teachers. So this truly is an open QA. We are glad to hear from any or all of you via the chat. But before we do that, our lead panelists, our authors of the scaling paper from SRI are with us. I didn't know, Jennifer or Sherry, if you wanted to say any opening words before we open the floor to questions.
Hi, we're in Jennifer's backyard, so hopefully no planes fly over. We're just really excited to share the report and the learning that we've had so far, and are really interested in hearing questions and feedback from those of you who are got to watch the presentation. And we really thank IES for exploring this topic with us, and excited about the potential for future projects using this framework.
Thanks, you all. So I have an eye on the chat. I would say my reaction to the presentations and to the SRI report in general is that scaling is sometimes a provocative topic. Sometimes scaling evokes ideas of commercialization or perhaps even sales, which is something that's not necessarily to everyone's something that we've all been trained to do or think about as part of our role. So I'm curious if anybody had any strongly positive or strongly negative reactions to the content they saw presented. And obviously, if panelists want to jump in, they should feel free to do so as well.
May I jump in, Roberta?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we thought about this as well in bringing out our language screener, but look, we are not trained to be sales people. There's no way that we as individuals who have created a product that we think is really important for children's development could begin to tap into the channels that a publisher like Brooks will have for trying to get our language screener adopted. None of us is going to make more than enough for a new purse and matching boots. This is what Lila Gleitman once said she wanted out of her book. But it's so important to us to get this out. That's the whole reason we did it, that it would have been impossible to even approach getting others to adopt that screener had we not approached a company.
Thanks, Roberta. Jay, I'm curious, you have had a lot of experience translating the intellectual materials into something that actually has appeared in classrooms and schools. Can you talk a bit about how that magic happened?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, I agree with Roberta. I don't think we're asking the researcher to then all of a sudden become a completely different person. But I think in many ways, and this is conversations that Carol and I have had, from the very beginning of working together on how do we get all children reading at grade level, is I think the researcher really needs to begin to put themselves in the mindset of the system or the district or the teacher classroom that they're going to be impacting. So I think there's a real difference between being a salesperson, which I think Roberta is absolutely right. That would be such a low use of Carol's talents, but to be able to think about how does her work impact those systems and ask those questions, that then shaped and framed how her research was developed. And I think in many ways, Matthew, as we kind of go back and think about that origin story, it really was coming together with Carol having this really powerful, impactful research, recognized at IES and supported there at IES and the department as a whole And then how do we really think very early on in that research of how do we get it to get stickiness? How do we get it to have value, beyond the research agenda? And so I think it was really more intentional than role playing, intentional about how do I support a salesperson to represent that is different than Carol having to develop a skill set around sales. And so I think, I use the term, and Jennifer referred to it in her presentation, about an embedded entrepreneur. I do think the sooner that you can marry them up, the sooner that you can get that kind of relationship going, the more powerful your opportunity is. And I don't say that just simply because that's the way that we did it. It is so easy to get into cul-de-sacs, both in taking things implementation and taking things to research, that you need to have this kind of dynamic to say, well, wait a second, what are we really trying to accomplish? And I remember Carol and I often having those conversations about what goes beyond, why is the research so important? What does the research get us to? So it's that very kind of endpoint focus. And I think that's what Chris was really emphasizing, is that Chris was really saying is, we are not apart from you guys. We're not other animals. We care as deeply and as passionately about what your research agenda is, but you've got to, and we've got to, as Chris said, the burden is on the educators as well, have to be much more open to having those dialogues earlier. So much now exists in terms of the research agenda, and I'll say it in terms of the implementation agenda at school districts. It's all about fait accompli. Here it is, the stone tablets, for Moses or whatever. And Carol started very early on thinking about teachers and administrators as her co-designers of the research. And so I think it's that early on, kind of, even when you start asking your research question, and as academics, we think about it, what are my research lines? As you're thinking about it, even at that kind of nuclear level, at the very beginning, it's who do I have to engage with to make it valuable, to make it real, to make it important? And that should be something that we're teaching our very earliest kids out of grad school, to start asking that kind of question. Who's going to be improved by, valued by, or live a better life because of the work that you're doing? And then start building that mental model from the very beginning.
That's great, Jay. Reactions from any of the panelists? We've got some other great questions in the chat as well.
Well, Chris, do you want to say something, or shall I go ahead to answer that question in the chat?
You go ahead.
So Aiden, I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced, and I hate to do it an injustice, wants to know how we can.
Thank you for asking.
Would you say it, please?
Aiden.
Aiden, so I had it right the first time. Wants to know how we continue to collect data and ensure the product's integrity is maintained, although with the standardized tool, she thinks this is less of a problem. So we have norms from all over the country for this instrument, because in today's world, you don't have to just test the kids in your backyard. Given the internet, we were able to appeal to various organizations around the country, and they helped us collect the data. Now, we had worked with this Harvard group, as I mentioned, and they used our test with 6-year-olds, and we had not planned to include 6-year-olds, but when the norms came back from them, and they looked no different in the way they distributed than the norms for 5s, we thought that was a fair thing to do. Now, people in the field are starting to use this instrument. At the present time, there is no need for us to engender new norms. I could see where that would happen in time, as children change and cohorts change, but right now we're just at the beginning of the use of these instruments. We also have the Quills ES, which is for bilingual children who speak English and Spanish, and that has been released by Brooks as well. So we will keep an eye on it, but I don't think that it is necessary for us to engender new norms at this time. I think the norms are representative of kids around the country. There are others now who are adopting this technique to create a test in France. I know they want to do it in Italy. And in other countries, including England, because the English language there is not exactly the same as what we use on this side of the pond.
Jay, would you add anything to that?
No, but I'll pick up the next question in terms of investors and companies and that kind of stuff. There's really a huge divide in the marketplace when we started talking about investors and companies. Most of them could care less about research. You know, by and large, it really is whatever we can get out there that we can push in the marketplace. And so part of that is that researchers have, in many ways, by only talking to themselves, have really left the field wide open for things that don't rise to that level. The other thing, and I think this is where the Department of Ed could be very helpful about, is we've allowed evidence and research base to be so broadly defined that there really isn't any reward to research that actually works, to research that really gets to an end result. Because then everybody can say, well, I have a pre-post test or whatever it might be. And so we've so watered down what we mean by evidence, and we've undervalued and underemphasized, you know, the S is strong, the RCT type of thing, that it's almost impossible for me to even get my potential customers to look at that, because that's not a relevancy for them. Their checkoff mark from the state policy is it evidence or research based, and that could be almost anything. And so I think the companies aren't really valuing the research, the heavy research that's being funded by IES, because first, we're not connecting to it. And secondly, we're not making it market valuable, right? Is that they don't have to have randomized controlled trials to sell stuff. Now, another part of thinking about it when you're thinking about the marketplace and you're thinking about investors in companies is I almost, and I've completely avoided going to venture capital dollars because they really don't value the outcome. They value in terms of how does it look? Does it, can I turn it around quickly? So if there's multiple pieces that are involved in the product, it's hard to get venture capital dollars to focus on the outcome. They want to focus on the one thing that might sell, that might raise dollars. So that's why I've been very dependent on Department of Education funding, because I needed to keep the focus on the goal of more kids reading at grade level. And that's, and the department has been very helpful in terms of being able to keep us focused on that area. The last thing that I'm going to mention is there are a lot of companies that do a lot of good work of embracing research that's out there. So I don't want to just do it with such a broad brush. But I think you also have to think about your research in terms of two really big buckets. One, and Jennifer and the presentation talked about this. One bucket is your research an enhancement of what is presently there? If it's an enhancement of what's presently there, there's a market that already exists, and there's a way of connecting with that market and having that natural evolution, and you should know that. The other side of it, where you really have heavy value on research, not by the market, but by getting to results, is are you a change in the system? Are you a basic change in how people go about doing or delivering something in the classroom or in the school level? And so I think those two big distinguishers will help you think about how to pursue dollars in the open marketplace.
So I don't know if anyone else wants to ask something, or if I could pick up Rebecca Landis' question.
I think I was just gonna add one thing, Roberta, which is about whether what we're proposing to do as a innovation, as a full, as Jennifer was talking about, is a full solution or a feature. That sometimes we identify ways to improve a practice or process, but if we aren't showing how it fits really well with the widely used curricula or assessments, it is really hard to adopt. So thinking about those kinds of questions early, it's not so much about going out and being the salesperson, but thinking about those design questions early, I think, is the main purpose of the kinds of questions we lay out in the framework.
Thanks, Sherry. That's great. Roberta, do you want to go on to Rebecca's question?
So I just have to react a little bit. Everyone wants children to read. Everyone wants children to do math. But I am afraid that there are many, many educators in the United States who do not realize the critical role that language plays in children's social, emotional, and intellectual development. And this, in a way, is what me and my colleagues have been doing for years, which is writing and speaking about the importance of language. And I don't know how much more, I mean, we just keep trying. The company that we're working with, Brooks, is one of the good ones, I can say to Jay, because they have not pushed us to do anything in particular. And they do seem to understand the underpinnings of the research. And that is very gratifying. Now, there's something else that Jay said I gotta react to, and that is many of us avoid the press like COVID. And if we continue to do that, we leave the marketplace open for all the charlatans that Jay alluded to. The more we can educate the public about what it means to get good information about how kids learn and to apply that, the more we are likely to make a dent in the world of education too. So we really need to start engaging with the press when they want to know what it is we're about and what it is we're doing. And because I'm such a nag on this topic, IES has had several sessions where we have talked about how to go about disseminating and speaking to the press. And that's really a very important thing we should all take on, in my view.
Somebody just respond. It is not nagging, Roberta. We appreciate the helpful feedback, and that's something we continue to value and think about how we can do better. So for those of you who have an interest in communication or dissemination, I believe strongly that if you send an email to Liz Albro, if you're an NCER grantee, Joan McLaughlin, if you're an ICSR grantee, and express that interest, that would be helpful in us thinking about the kind of technical support we provide PIs, because that's something that we're actively thinking about. There's a real pragmatic question I want to pick off the list here that perhaps Jen or Sherry can address. Is from Elizabeth Swanson. Stakeholder mapping. Is there a tool that just comes right to mind, Jen, about good stakeholder mapping?
I think we tried to articulate the best that we could in the paper and give an example, but depending on whether the innovation is an ed tech product, a curriculum, or an assessment, your stakeholders or gatekeepers will be different. But I think number one is identifying who your customer is. And I think starting there will then help you identify the ecosystem around it. I don't know if Chris, you may have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Everything that's worth doing is complicated. So I would be a gatekeeper in general, but there are specific people that you probably would have richer conversations because I'm a generalist. I don't know. I can't know K-12 curriculum and research the way I should. It's just not possible. So I do think one of the things I like about being part of this project is that we have a common language around it, a framework that we can talk about. And that is exciting to me. But it's a difficult thing to do. And I get into a lot of different schools nationwide. And I can tell you that sometimes the person who has the title isn't the most influential by any stretch of the imagination. Sorry, I couldn't solve that problem.
That's right. I think it's an acknowledged one. Absolutely. Sarah Powell has a question. So if you have successfully scaled and your work is out there being used by teachers or whatever the end user is of your product, how is it that you all have found good ways to get information about how things are being implemented if those teachers aren't part of your research team? So once you've let your baby out of the walled garden, how do you know if it's being used the way you had intended?
I can just talk about for our specific product, Matt. Carol, knowing that, really started with thinking about it as a huge data warehouse from the very beginning. And as a technical product, she established all of the data to flow with the child. So whatever learning environment that child was in, whether it was in the classroom or the intervention or the home now or the after school program, we could collect that data. And then we knew in terms of what the teacher was doing on the platform, we're also collecting that data. So it's a huge data warehouse. So even though it's fledged, if you will, it's out in the wild, a very important part of it is we never intended it to be totally wild. We always intended it to have that kind of research component, because a part of that then is to how do you also support your environment. And Carol knew that the ability to support data in a meaningful way versus just collecting data was really important. So having the data dashboards that we built recently and how we present it to those different gatekeeper groups, whether it's the equity office or the MTSS office or the curriculum office or the principal, they speak different languages. So we're taking data points and presenting the data in their language, right? And so by that, that's allowed us then to also have a robust ongoing kind of research presence. And right now we have 3 IES grants that are using the platform for the research presence that provides. So I think that was something thought about very early on in the beginning, is that you should always try to understand what it's doing in the wild. There shouldn't be this kind of, wall that I'm just going to throw it over the wall. There should always be that sense of interaction, because I think ultimately where we get to the world that Chris is talking about is where research and activity are almost one and the same. They're just an iterative process that we're trying to move down that spectrum together. And I think we're really striking that out in terms of our partnerships with our districts.
So clearly there's some advantages when you have a tech-enabled innovation, right? Because you have that constant. Roberta, I'm curious, you've been working in a somewhat different way. How's that been going for you?
So I would respond to Sarah Powell's chat idea by asking if the teachers who are willing to take the free materials will also agree to fill out something like a tripod questionnaire at the end of the term about how the materials that they downloaded are working. That's kind of a freebie. What Jay talked about is getting grants. And of course, that is essential if you're going to do a hardcore look at what's going on in the classroom for, as Jim Stone points out, fidelity of treatment. It's a really interesting thing, though, to look for fidelity, because in a recent paper by Liz Hadley, for example, that used a playful learning approach to teaching kids vocabulary in preschool classrooms, we found that it was really difficult for teachers to ask open-ended questions, even though they were given instruction and support to do so. So sometimes you find things out that are surprising, and that's another reason why we want to study fidelity, in addition to understanding whether other aspects of the treatment are working. Now, Sarah writes they could incorporate that. They aren't doing anything like that at this time, and it couldn't hurt. I mean, there may be people who say, I don't have time to do that, but they can emphasize that the questionnaire will be no more than 20 items, and they can leave their email and you can get back to them. If you also emphasize that you want to know what kinds of improvements they would like to see in the material and take their knowledge, I'll bet that you will get some people without a big grant to study fidelity telling you whether or not what you developed worked.
Having been part of many ed tech groups trying to make an impact in my career, I will just say that if you go into user group and you just listen to the people who are evaluating not only the data, but the ease of use, the people who are asking the good questions are the people that you want to talk to. And like Jay said very eloquently, it should be iterative, because when it goes out into the wild, it's such variability from state to state, from district to district. You all know this already, but you know the smart people in the room pretty quickly, and having a relationship with them and a framework to talk around is a great way to make sure that your research is actually getting into the minds of students.
So it strikes me as just a somewhat different way of thinking about the roles and responsibilities of a researcher and developer, right? Being sure that we close that loop, perhaps in ways we haven't before. And certainly, I was not trained in my PhD program to think about this at all, but it does seem like it's something that increasingly, if you're, whether it's a feature or a product, if you're trying to have your work really make an impact in the classroom, it's thinking about this endeavor in somewhat larger terms than we have before seems important.
Mm.
Yep, and Jim is commenting kind of in the same vein, like a rollout must include professional development. Again, something that's not necessarily, what you're thinking about at the time you're writing that initial 305A grant or 324 grant, right?
And be careful of not treating your professional development as another market addition. So many of the professional development comes as, oh, and then you pay another X amount of dollars, because a lot of people choose not to do that. And so then, I can't tell you the number of research things that I'm talking about that come from the marketplace, not from IES, but that come from the marketplace and say, well, what we're just now is giving you the people that actually used our product the way it was. And when you peel back behind that, that's a small fraction of the people that bought it. And so I think you got to be able to, when you're delivering research, deliver it in a way that you're doing everything you can for that faithful delivery. But then when you're designing research, you got to make that hurdle very low, because that's another problem that we have in terms of research. Research are blessed with postgraduates. So man hours is free for us. Whereas in the real world, man hours are costly. And so I think what we've got to do is make sure that when we're envisioning our, rollouts, our professional development or whatever, we're making that barrier low. And what we do is just build it as part. We don't sell without the professional development. It is part of the whole systems package to get to outcomes. It's not severable. And so I think that's just a very important way of how to think about it. For us, it didn't matter that the research could get kids to outcomes if when it was actually out there, it wasn't getting kids to outcomes. So the research and the professional development was a very key part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that there's great variability in professional development. And it can depend on the culture of the company. It can depend on a lot of different things. And as a person who delivers some professional development, I think there should be standards that are discussed about what is required, and have that mapped out.
That is such a great point. Can I comment on that? Professional development often has a bad name. And it's often the case that, I don't know if I want to say often, but sometimes teachers feel like it was a waste of time. Now, in order to get people to adopt whatever it is you have, and to really want to do it, you've got to show, you got to prove in a way that it makes a difference for kids' lives. And that has to be part of what the professional development is about. Unfortunately, teachers in the United States have had so many new things come down the pike, right, Chris, that it's hard for them to buy into anything. But okay, so the principles that I talked about before that underlie how children learn, and the 6 C's are the kinds of things that have to be instantiated in our professional development as well. That is, it shouldn't be the sage on the stage that just talks to the people in the audience and treats them like they're empty vessels. It should be active, it should be meaningful, and we should help them link it up to their lives. It should be engaging. It should be, all the principles of learning should be employed, because, for example, for what we're doing with the ultimate playbook for reimagining education, our professional development has to mirror what we want them to do with kids. If it's a sage on the stage model and we're telling them abandon the sage on the stage model, you need to be the guide by the side, then we have to do something with the teachers that is absolutely consonant with what we are after. We really need to help teachers to see if we're serious about getting our something, whatever it is, adopted, that it is so worthwhile for children that they will learn if they work with us. I emphasize the with during the professional development time that they put in.
Yeah, Shelley just said coaching, and we have invested in coaching because we believe that this implementation of research, of software or whatever, it's probably at the very least a 3-year minimum for it to be operationalized. So we want it to be in, and I'm going to use atomic habits. We want these things to be atomic habits for our teachers, so ingrained that we wouldn't even question it. It's just part of the routine. But that does not happen. The shininess wears off.
Yeah.
Very fast. So I totally think that our coaches are the ones who are, again, shoulder to shoulder. I've been a classroom teacher. I know you're overwhelmed right now. The information age has overwhelmed us all. And, and I think we're not spending nearly enough money on educational grants. But when all these papers come out, it's not like teachers go home at night and read them. They have to be contextualized and presented in a way that is consumable. And I do believe coaches have a big part of that.
Yes.
Well, let me pick up. Oh, sorry, Brad. There's one question in the chat I don't want to miss out on. Yeah. Because I feel like Mike might think that we saw his question and passed over because we didn't want to address it. And it's an important one, which is, how long does this all take? If you're going to do the SRI from kind of market need sensing to efficacy testing, can you do that in a 5-year IES grant?
Jen's pointing at me. I would say that one of the things we think has to happen is creating the kind of minimal viable product up front and really sharing those ideas, that framework with different potential users and customers before engaging in the highly rigorous research that we want to invest in to make sure that it's going to work, because we might have to do changes to the design, and that will then impact, we want to know that the outcomes are going to be for the design that we're going to come up with. So to me, as we did this research, what I learned is in education, we want to focus first on, do we get that outcome? And then we go back later and think about changing things to make it a little bit more convenient or easier. And that's the opposite of the way other fields do it, where they really make sure it works in the system, that, folks are feeling they're getting their needs met. It's reducing the work that they have to do, that they're seeing the value in it, and then it gets tested, for outcomes. So I can't speak to the existing, exact outline of how we approach the work, but it does raise some big questions for us to all consider about the order in which we address these activities.
And I think
So I'm hearing you say that development innovation phase is really critical, right? Sorry, Jen, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and I think, that some of the top 3 activities, and these are a lot of the framework, is to just bring up questions that should be asked, and start the dialogue between all the different stakeholders early. And one, it's initial market analysis, stakeholder mapping, to really understand the needs of your users and customers and the design partners, and getting that feedback right at the start, because as Sherry just said, you really need to understand all of this before going into testing, rigorous testing. So those are the recommendations that we have that should happen before all of the tests. And even on a time scale, I think a lot of the feedback that you can receive, a lot of the secondary analysis that you can do on the competition, and actually the most important thing that I forgot to mention was making sure that this is a high priority need. You're addressing a high priority need that is recognized by the end user, by your customer. And these are things that should be done early.
Great, thanks, Jen. Final reflections from our panelists or for folks in the audience. I will say, for those of you who took a look at 305A or 324 this year, the RFA, you probably saw, not for the first time, but hopefully you saw a more intense focus in some of those early questions that Jen began to mention. There's words in there that were very explicitly pulled from the SRI report. We took their suggestions to heart and have begun to think about how it is they should influence both, our grant making and the support we provide PIs. I would expect that this would only continue to be increasingly emphasized as time goes on. I think all of us have heard Mark talk really clearly about not just the importance of the work you do, but the urgency of the problem we face and how we have to be sure that your good work gets into the classroom. So we will keep pushing on this, and certainly in the near term, but hopefully for the years to come. All right, I'm looking here to see if we have any more questions.
Matt, I just had one kind of resource that's available to the researchers. Is right now, most Research One universities have a fairly strong entrepreneurial or tech transfer office. I can think of SkySong at ASU. I can think of the Cove at UCI. I know there's similar facilities that are at the University of Michigan. In every single one that I participate in, I've usually been an entrepreneur in residence, whatever university that Carol took me to, is that every single one of those is profoundly underrepresented with from education researchers. There's a lot of bio folks. There's a lot of environmental folks. There's a whole range of almost any different school of engineering that's taking advantage of these entrepreneurial business kind of courses, the games in terms of building products and that type of stuff. And it's very rarely, I've had to go out and recruit grad students from the education schools to even participate in that. There are natural places on each one of your universities that would be partners for you to start asking some of those questions very early on. And having been an entrepreneurial resident in a number of them, we would love to have you come over and play with us, because the passion of investors, and I want to correct maybe a misimpression that I gave earlier, the passion of investors to be able to get to outcomes, to have social impact, is probably now higher than I've ever seen it before. The great point is we aren't being with them. We aren't engaging ourselves. So other people that are, taking carbon out of the air or cleaning the water or whatever, or, helping to improve, diabetes treatment, they're getting all of the attention. So if I were a dean, and I've talked this to Richard, who's the dean at the UCI, is I would push kids, graduate students, to those free efforts. You don't have to, take an MBA course. Frankly, I'd recommend you not take an MBA course, is to those free efforts. And we are more than willing to engage. And you can get free entrepreneurial support right there on each and every one of your campuses. Walk out of your buildings, it's there on campus.
I don't think we could end with a better sentiment. I know we're at 3:45, which I believe is time. Thank you all for joining with us today. Many thanks to our presenters who came back to talk with us today and endure the 55-degree cold apparently in the Bay Area today. Again, thank you so much. If you have questions, please send them to us. Mark, our director's email is always open, as is mine, Joan, or Liz's. We'd love to talk with you more about scaling and making your work as impactful as possible. Thanks again, and have a really great day, you guys. Be well.
You too.